Welcome. In this screencast, I will be using a strategy called a think aloud to model how to create a lesson plan using the Upper Iowa University lesson planning template. The purpose of a think aloud is to make transparent the cognitive processes needed to perform a task. Think alouds are an effective way for teachers to model the thinking that they want their students to embrace. When creating a lesson plan, I first need to understand the big picture. What exactly do I want my students to know and be able to do? Why is it important for them to learn this? And how will I communicate it to my students so we'll both know what this learning will look like when it's mastered? I always start with the academic standards. These are the expectations that have been determined for my grade level. Next, I need to wrap my brain around the why behind the standard. This leads me to my learning outcome and my essential question. The learning outcome is the big picture reason for this standard, and the essential question is what I will use to engage students in the learning and help deepen their understanding. Essential questions help students make sense of the importance of this learning. Take a look at the standard that I've chosen, the learning outcome, and the essential question, and how they work together. My next step is to break down the standard down into manageable pieces. This is often referred to as unpacking the standard or unwrapping the standard. The reason for doing this is so that you can chunk the learning. Chunking is a strategy that is used to reduce the cognitive load or demands on a learner. It allows the learner, to master smaller bits that build on each other that will lead to successfully mastering the entire standard. As I unpack the standard, I also want to make sure that I'm meeting the rigor that is expected for this grade. This is where Bloom's and depth of knowledge, or DOK, come in. Bloom's helps me to figure out the type of thinking I want students to do, while DOK helps me think about how deeply I want them to be thinking and using this knowledge. In the literacy academic standards, Iowa has indicated the DOK levels that are expected. I want to make sure that my learning objectives match the vigor and the rigor intended by the depth of knowledge level. Take a look at the lesson objectives and the Bloom's level in DOK and how they connect. My last task will be to change these lesson objectives into a more student-friendly language so that I can share them with these expectations with my students. For this, I create I can statements, or some people call learning targets. Take a look at these learning targets and how they are the student-friendly version of the lesson objectives. Phew, that's a lot of work, but I need to remember that this part will help guide several lessons. Next, I'll need to be able to identify the focus for today's lesson. Take a look at the yellow highlighted areas. This is what I've chosen for creating for the focus for today's lesson. Now that I've chosen that focus, I'm ready to plan the details for the day's lesson. I start by identifying the most important vocabulary that I want students to know and use. There are many ways I can help students learn this vocabulary. I could do a completely separate mini lesson just on these words. I could start my lesson explaining the words, or I could embed them in the body of the lesson. I'm going to choose to do the latter. I will include them as I go along in my lesson. Now I need to think about how I will start my lesson. I want to activate students' prior knowledge. Because this is not the first lesson for the standard, I need to connect to what we have done in previous days. I'm going to review our first essential question and what we learned, and then introduce them to the second part of the essential question. I'm also going to use an analogy to help them understand about evidence and proof. This will give students something to connect to, as well as a reason why this learning is important. I also want to get students' voice in within the first 5 to 10 minutes. So I'm going to do a think, pair, share with a partner so that they can make their own personal connections. Take a look at my lesson plan and how I have created the steps for this section. Now that I'm ready for students to acquire the new information, the new learning that I want them to know today, I am going to use a gradual release of responsibility model where I first model, then I'll have students practice before I send them off to apply this knowledge and skills on their own. This ANI section, or acquire new information section, will be my I do section. I will make sure to start with the learning target or the I can statement so students are clear on what the learning expectation for today is. I'm also going to do a quick vocab definition, an example of refer, then repeat the learning expectation. I will model the exact thinking that I will want my students to use. Take a look at my ANI section. Once I've modeled, I'll move to the application or the APP section and my next step in the gradual release of responsibility model, the we do section. I will want to check for understanding to make sure students are understanding what the task is as they work with me on this. Once I see that students can do this with my support, I'll reinforce the learning target and the essential question. And then I'm going to release a little bit more responsibility to them. I'm going to have them work with a partner to do the task. Again, I'll be walking around checking for understanding. Take a look at my plan for the APP section. Now it's time for me to close my lesson. This is where I will connect back to that learning target and essential question to summarize and reinforce today's learning. I know it's important to always get student voice in, so I will have them pair share again to say how they have met the learning target and have them think about how it connects to the essential question. I'm going to let students know I'm going to check their understanding by giving them a brand new passage to do all on their own. This is the last part of gradual release of responsibility, the you do. And because it is a different passage, because it is a different passage, I'll be able to see if they can apply and transfer this learning. I will also use this as my formative assessment. I'll develop a simple grading rubric that I can use that will help me create small group instruction to meet specific student needs. This extra instruction based on these student needs will help me to ensure all students meet the learning expectations that will be on the summative assessment at the end of the unit. Take a look at how I close my lesson and how I will be checking for understanding through my formative assessment. All along the way, I will be noting what students will need accommodation and modifications and what materials I will use. I'll be using my students' IEPs, 504 plans, or English language learner LEAP plans to be able to identify exactly what these particular students will need. also want to think about the needs of other students that don't have these special education needs I've identified. I want to think of how I can differentiate. I know there are four main ways to differentiate. I can differentiate by content, by process, the product, or the learning environment. In this lesson, I'm already thinking ahead about small group needs. I will have a couple of passages ready that I can use with students who need more practice. I'm also going to have students who have mastered this apply this learning to their daily reading. Here are some things that will be important for me to remember when I'm writing a lesson plan. I always want to start with the end in mind. I want to know specifically what the standard is and what my learning targets will be. I need to think about the why students need to learn this and develop that essential question. And I need to also be thinking about what mastery looks like. What would be the product that would let me know that students can do the skill that I've identified? I need to think about how I can make connections for with the students to activate their prior knowledge. How will today's learning connect to previous learning? How might today's learning connect to a real life experience? And how will I purposely make connections to the learning target and essential question throughout my lesson? One of the things you'll notice is that I constantly went back to that question and back to that learning target to help remind students what we're learning and why we're learning it. I also will plan on how I'll use gradual release for the students. I'll think about how I will have engagement. How I can have them think, pair, share, and chorally read. I'm going to provide multiple opportunities to reinforce the learning and practice after this lesson as well. So this is the end of the Think Aloud for how to create a lesson plan. I hope it will help you in creating your own lesson plans. Thank you.